silence of the night was only broken by the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Sarah stirred in her sleep, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she should get up or not. The clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m. Whatever had woken her would probably go away soon, so she lay still, hoping to drift back to sleep. But it didn't come. As the minutes ticked by, she could feel her eyes getting droopy again. But just as they were closing, she heard it again, a soft, metallic clink followed by what sounded like footsteps. She sat up in bed now. Her heart was beating faster. Footsteps in the middle of the night, in her house. She was sure that she lived alone. At least she thought she did. For a while, she listened intently, straining to hear anything else. But there was nothing, just the steady thump, thump of her heart in her ears. After a few minutes, she told herself that it had probably been a branch tapping against the window in the storm. It was always doing that. Plus, there was no way that anyone would be walking around in the middle of the night, right? Still, she couldn't help but glance at the door. It was slightly ajar, and the sliver of light spilling out from under it was shaped oddly, like the top half of the door had been chopped off. That couldn't be right. She had shut the door all the way before going to bed. Had her son Lucas left his door open again? He was so careless sometimes. But no, he was visiting his girlfriend and would be back tomorrow. It was just her in the house. She got up and walked over to the fridge, its cheery light spilling out onto the floor when she opened it. She took out the carton of milk that she used to make coffee and poured herself a glass. As she drank it, she glanced into the dark recesses of the fridge, the shadows seeming to writhe and dance in the dim light. A chill went down her spine. What if it had been more than a branch outside? What if there had been someone in the house? Maybe an intruder? No, that was ridiculous. When she moved into this old house, the previous owner had assured her that all the locks had been changed. And anyway, she kept a baseball bat under her bed just in case. Still, she couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. She poured herself another glass of milk and drank it, trying to calm her nerves. Then she noticed something strange. The milk had turned black. She stared at it in disbelief. It was definitely fresh. She had bought it just 2 days ago. Besides, the expiration date hadn't passed. Yet it looked like old motor oil. She poured it down the sink and turned on the tap to fill the glass. With fresh milk, it seemed ridiculous to be scared of a carton of milk turning black. Surely there was a rational explanation, but the fridge had malfunctioned. But then she remembered the footsteps. Whoever or whatever had made them must have tampered with the fridge. She needed to check on her phone, but where was it? She rummaged through the cupboards until she found it. The battery was dead. Of course it was. Why hadn't she thought of that before? She plugged it in and waited anxiously for it to turn on. Maybe she could call the police. But as she dialed 911, the power went out. The phone slipped from her hand and crashed to the floor, the screen spiderwebbing across the surface. Now what? She needed to get out of the house, to run away from whatever was happening to her. But as she reached for the doorknob, it turned. She whirled around to see who was there, her heart pounding in her chest. And that's when she saw him. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn in the darkness. His eyes were wide and fearful, staring straight ahead. It looked like a ghost, or worse, a corpse. Then she saw the blood. It was coming from under his shirt, staining the floor a dark crimson. He was kneeling on the floor as if in prayer. She screamed and stumbled back, knocking over her kitchen chair. He raised his head and she could see his face clearly now. Or what was left of it. There was no face. Where there should have been one, there was only a gaping hole, a void of darkness that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Then he started to move. He slithered forward on his knees, his gaze never leaving hers. She could see the blood dripping from his hands, his arms, his entire body. It was everywhere. And then he spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper that seemed to scrape against her bones. "Don't trust the fridge," he rasped. "It wants your soul." And with that, he vanished. She stood frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The sound of his voice echoed in her ears, and the image of his faceless form burned into her retinas. Was she going crazy? Had the stress of living alone finally driven her over the edge? She needed to get out of the house, to get away from the fridge, from the faceless man and the nightmare he had brought with him. She ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock. Finally, she got it open and stumbled out onto the porch. The cool night air hit her like a wave, bringing with it the sounds of the crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. That's when she heard it again, the sound that had woken her in the first place. Whatever it was coming for her. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get away, to get help. But as she turned to run, she saw the faceless man standing in the yard. His eyes were glowing red in the darkness, and he was smiling. A wide, horrifying grin that showed the darkness that lay within his empty sockets. She screamed and ran in the opposite direction. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away from the house, from the faceless man and the footsteps that still echoed in her ears. She didn't stop running until she reached the road. Then she looked back at the house. The windows were dark and silent. Maybe it had all been a dream. Maybe it was just the wind making the fridge hum and the old house creaking. Maybe there was no such thing as ghosts or monsters. But as she turned to leave, she saw the baseball bat lying in the grass where she had knocked it over during her frantic escape. And that's when she noticed the blood. It was on the bat, staining it a dark crimson. And as she stared at it in disbelief, she heard the footsteps again, this time coming from the road. The faceless man was coming for her. Sarah woke up with a gasp. The clock on the bedside table read 6 a.m. The nightmare was over. She was safe. But as she turned to snuggle closer to her husband, she realized he wasn't there. The bed was cold. The side of it where he slept was untouched. It was as if he had never been there at all. She threw off the bed sheets and rushed to the door. She needed to get out of the house, to get away from the fridge, from the faceless man. As she opened the door, she saw it, the faceless man. He was standing in the hallway, his eyes glowing red in the darkness, and he was smiling, his grin wide and horrifying. "Don't trust the fridge," he rasped, his voice a whisper that scraped against her bones. "It wants your soul." Then he vanished. She slammed the door behind her and ran to the kitchen. The fridge was humming softly, its cheerful light spilling out onto the floor. She stared at it in disbelief. What was it about the fridge? What did it want? Needed to get out of the house, to get away from it all. But as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were coming from the fridge. It was opening. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, tripping over her own feet. As she fell, she saw it, the faceless man. He was standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing red. "Don't trust the fridge," he whispered. "It wants your soul." And with that, he lunged for her. She awoke with a jolt. The clock on the bedside table read 6:17 a.m. The nightmare was over. She was safe. But as she turned to snuggle closer to her husband, she realized he wasn't there. The bed was cold. The side of it where he slept was untouched. It was as if he had never been there at all. She threw off the bedsheets and rushed to the door. She needed to get out of the house, to get away from the fridge, from the faceless man. But as she opened the door, she saw it, the faceless man. He was standing in the hallway, his eyes glowing red in the darkness, and he was smiling, his grin wide and horrifying. "Don't trust the fridge," he rasped, his voice a whisper that scraped against her bones. "It wants your soul." Then he vanished. She slammed the door behind her and ran to the kitchen. The fridge was humming softly, its cheerful light spilling out onto the floor. She stared at it in disbelief. What was it about the fridge? What did it want? As she reached for the handle, the door swung open, revealing a darkness that seemed to consume the very light around it. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. Inside the fridge, she could have sworn she saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at her. Suddenly, the faceless man appeared in front of her, his ghostly form shimmering in the darkness. "Don't trust it," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo. "It feeds on fear, craves the warmth of living souls." Understanding dawned on Sarah. The faceless man wasn't a monster, but a desperate spirit trapped between worlds, seeking to warn her about the fridge. It was a portal, a gateway to a realm of darkness that thrived on human emotions, especially fear. and it seemed to be sentient, aware, hungry. She slammed the door shut, the metal handle digging into her palm. She knew she couldn't stay in that house, not while the fridge, the gateway to that terrifying realm, was there. The faceless man was gone, vanished into the darkness of the fridge, leaving her alone with the hum and the chilling warning. But the question remained. Where would she go? Who could she turn to when the darkness was watching, waiting for her next move? And how could she escape its grasp without feeding its insatiable hunger for fear? The answers, Sarah feared, lay hidden in the depths of that very fridge, shrouded in a darkness that threatened to consume her whole.